Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into an incredible story, how 13 colonies, once just a piece of the unstoppable British Empire, decided to take on a global superpower and create a brand new nation. In 1776, they put it all on the line, declaring independence and preparing to fight one of the most powerful armies in the world.
Okay, so this timeline is basically our roadmap. And what's really interesting is where it all starts, not with a rebellion, but in 1763, right after a massive global war. From there, we'll see how things escalated to the explosive declaration in 1776, the long, hard fight for victory in 83, and finally, the creation of a whole new kind of government in 1787.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the price of empire. Then, we'll see how simple protests spiraled into a full-blown rebellion. We'll watch a new nation get declared, follow the incredible long-shot war for independence, and finally, explore how they tried to build a new world from the ashes of the old one.
So, let's get into it. Our story kicks off not with revolutionaries in the streets, but with an accountant's nightmare, the massive, crushing debt that came from winning a huge war.
You've got to picture this. The 7 Years' War was basically a world war between the era's two biggest superpowers, Britain and France, fighting for control of the planet. And when the smoke cleared, Britain had won. They had a massive, sprawling new empire, but they were flat broke. The victory was sweet, but the national debt was absolutely mind-boggling.
So the British Crown had a serious problem on its hands. I mean, what do governments do when they're buried in debt? They look for new ways to make money. And as they scanned their global empire, their eyes landed squarely on their 13 pretty prosperous colonies over in North America.
Now, from London's point of view, the solution seemed perfectly fair. The war was fought, at least in part, to protect the American colonies, so it only made sense that the colonists should help pay the bill. This led to a whole wave of new direct taxes, first on sugar, then a really unpopular one on all paper goods called the Stamp Act, and then the Townshend Acts, which taxed all sorts of everyday imports.
But what seemed like a totally logical financial plan in London, well, across the Atlantic, it landed like a bombshell. This stopped being about money very quickly and became all about fundamental rights.
You've all heard this phrase, and it became the powerful, unifying rallying cry. The colonists argued that their basic rights as Englishmen were being trampled on. They didn't elect anyone to the British Parliament, so how could a parliament thousands of miles away have the right to take their money? In their eyes, any tax like this wasn't just unfair, it was an act of tyranny.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the conflict. You had two completely different points of view. Britain was thinking, look, Parliament runs the whole empire, and you're part of it. You have to pay your share. But the colonists were thinking, whoa, hold on. We have our own local governments. You can't just reach into our pockets without us having a say in the matter. It was a total breakdown in communication.
So talk quickly turned into action. Groups like the Sons of Liberty started organizing boycotts and protests. Things got really ugly in 1770 with the Boston Massacre. And then came the Tea Act. The funny thing is, it wasn't about the price, it actually made tea cheaper. It was about the principle of a monopoly, and it led to the Boston Tea Party, this huge, dramatic act of public defiance.
So, did Britain back down? Did they try to compromise? Nope, they doubled down, hard. In response, Parliament passed the set of laws that the colonists nicknamed the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port and basically put the entire colony of Massachusetts under military rule.
But this heavy-handed response, it backfired, big time. Instead of crushing the rebellion in Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts just made the other colonies furious. It was the move that pushed everyone past the point of no return and straight towards war.
So what happens next? The colonies get organized. Representatives from all over met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They sent a formal petition to King George III, basically saying, let us handle our own business. The king said no, and that was it. The time for talking was over. The very next spring, the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, and the war was on.
Okay, so we're officially at war. The colonies need a government, and they need an army. The Second Continental Congress steps in to act as a sort of makeshift national government. And one of the first things they do is create the Continental Army. To lead it, they make a brilliant choice, a well-respected military man from Virginia named George Washington. You know, it's pretty interesting. Even with fighting underway, a lot of colonists were still hoping to somehow patch things up with Britain. But as the conflict dragged on and blood was shed, that sentiment started to change. A little over a year into the war, Congress decided it was time to make the break final.
And this was a total game changer. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just another angry letter about taxes. Drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson, it laid out this incredible, universal vision of human rights, equality, liberty, the right of people to choose their own government. This is the moment a tax protest officially becomes a revolution of ideas that would change the world.
All right, so they declared independence. That's the easy part, right? Now they actually had to win it against the biggest, baddest military on the planet. The odds against them were, to put it mildly, astronomical. The game plan for both sides couldn't have been more different. The British wanted to force one big knockout battle to just crush the rebellion and go home. But George Washington knew he couldn't win that fight. So he adopted a brilliant strategy. Just don't lose. He used his knowledge of the land, fought a gritty war of attrition, and did whatever it took to just keep his army in one piece. He played the long game.
And then comes the moment that changes everything. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The Americans pull off a shocking victory, and this is huge. Why? Because it proved to a watching world, especially France, that these colonists could actually win. It was the proof of concept that convinced France and later Spain to jump into the war against Britain. That support was the ultimate game changer.
So after years of brutal fighting, the impossible happens. The Americans win. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 makes it official. But now comes the really hard part. It's one thing to win a war. It's another thing entirely to build a country from scratch.
Their first try at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was, well, it was a bit of a disaster. So the leaders got together again in 1787 and came up with the United States Constitution. And its first three words are everything. We, the people. This was radical. It declared that power doesn't come from a king or from God, it comes from the citizens themselves.
And to make sure they'd never face another king, they got really creative with the structure. They split the power into three separate but equal branches: a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. It was a brilliant system of checks and balances designed to protect liberty. And in 1789, who else but their wartime hero, George Washington, was elected the first president.
And you have to understand, the world was watching this whole experiment. This wasn't just an American story. The revolution was proof that the big ideas of the Enlightenment, liberty, self-government, could actually work in the real world. It was a direct inspiration for the French Revolution just a few years later, and for independence movements all across Latin America. It was like the first domino to fall.
And that kind of brings us full circle, right? The whole revolution was kicked off by a fight over who has the right to govern and who should have a voice. It makes you think, how do those same founding principles from an 18th century rebellion continue to shape our own debates today about freedom, power, and what it really means to have a government of the people?